It was 9:30 in the morning, May 1st, 1942. The air inside the converted mess hall of the battleship Yamato was thick with tension, the smell of stale coffee and the heavy weight of expectation. This was not just a ship, it was a floating fortress, the largest battleship ever constructed by human hands. 72,000 tons of steel designed to dominate the oceans. But on this morning, the battle was not being fought with guns or torpedoes. It was being fought with wooden blocks, paper maps, and a pair of dice. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki stood over a massive table that spanned 40 feet across the room. On it lay a grid representing the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. Around him stood 20 of the highest-ranking officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, their gold-braided uniforms gleaming under the electric lights. They were there to play a game, a war game. The objective was Midway Island, a tiny, insignificant speck of coral 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii. The plan was the masterpiece of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. It was elegant, complex, and deadly. The goal was to lure the American aircraft carriers into a trap, destroy them in a single, decisive afternoon, and force the United States to its knees to negotiate peace. On paper, it looked perfect. It involved coordinating hundreds of ships across thousands of miles, but before the real ships could sail, the plan had to be tested here, on the Yamato. The war game was designed to expose flaws, to find the cracks in the armour before lives were lost. It was supposed to be a stress test for the Empire's strategy. But there was a problem. The game was rigged. Admiral Ugaki was the chief umpire. He was the man responsible for interpreting the dice rolls that determined the outcome of battles. He was also the architect of the very plan being tested. He had a reputation to protect, and he had a victory to deliver. When the dice eventually predicted a catastrophe that would shatter the Imperial Navy, Ugaki didn't change the plan. He simply reached down, picked up the dice, and changed the rules. To understand why a high-ranking admiral would cheat at his own war game, you have to understand the mind of Japan. In the spring of 1942, the nation was drunk, not on sake, but on victory. For 6 months, the Imperial Navy had been unstoppable. They had carved out an empire that stretched from the freezing waters of the Aleutians to the tropical heat of the Dutch East Indies. Their success seemed endless, a divine wind pushing them forward. On December 7th, their carriers had broken the back of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. 10 hours later, they obliterated the American Air Force in the Philippines. 2 days after that, they sank the pride of the British Navy, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, proving that the age of the battleship was over and the age of air power had begun. Hong Kong fell on Christmas. Manila fell in January. Singapore, the fortress the British claimed was impregnable, surrendered in February. 85,000 troops marched into captivity. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies were seized. Burma fell, cutting off China. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, roamed the oceans like apex predators, striking at will and suffering zero losses. Their pilots flew the Mitsubishi Zero, a fighter plane so agile, so fast, and so deadly that Allied pilots reported it could outturn and outclimb anything in the sky. In Tokyo, the planners believed they were invincible. They stopped asking if they would win and started asking when the Americans would beg for terms. They called it victory disease. It is a psychological condition where success breeds arrogance. You stop looking for enemy strengths because you assume they have none. You stop planning for bad luck because you assume fate is on your side. You refuse to acknowledge that the enemy might learn, might adapt, or might just get lucky. This disease had infected every level of the Japanese command, from the lowest deckhand to Admiral Yamamoto himself. and it was this disease that was guiding the hands of the men standing around the map table on the Yamato. The war games were scheduled for 4 days. The massive table in the mess hall was a theatre of war. Wooden blocks labelled with ship names were pushed across the grid, coloured pins marked air raids, and the umpires rolled the dice to introduce the chaos of combat, calculating fuel, damage, and weather. In theory, this was the place to make mistakes. A good war game is honest. It reveals that your supply lines are too long or your timing is too tight. It saves lives by killing bad ideas on paper. But on the Yamato, the game had become a ritual. It was a ceremony designed to validate a decision that had already been made. Nobody wanted to find problems. Everyone wanted confirmation. The invasion force commander, Vice Admiral Nobutaki Kondo, was the only one who seemed worried. He looked at the vast distance between Japan and Midway, 1,400 miles, and asked a simple question. How do we supply the island once we take it? Convoys would be sitting ducks for American submarines. If they couldn't hold the island, taking it was pointless. His concerns were noted, written down, and immediately ignored. The plan was approved. The train had left the station. The first day went smoothly. Japanese forces advanced, Americans retreated. The umpires ruled consistently in Japan's favour. But on the second day, the impossible happened. The scenario had progressed to the invasion itself. The Japanese carriers were attacking Midway. In the game, a junior officer, playing the American commander, made a bold, aggressive move. He launched land-based bombers from Midway to strike the Japanese fleet, while their decks were crowded with planes refueling and rearming. It was a brilliant counterattack. In real warfare, a carrier is a floating powder keg. When flight decks are covered in aviation fuel and bombs, a single hit can start a chain reaction that obliterates the ship. The umpire for this section, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, picked up the dice to determine the damage. He rolled. The result was a 9. He checked the damage tables. A 9 meant catastrophic impact. 2 carriers, the Akagi and the Kaga, were ruled sunk, destroyed, gone. The room went silent. Admiral Ugaki stared at the table. 2 carriers lost to a handful of land-based bombers. It was inconceivable. It contradicted the narrative of invincibility. It ruined the beautiful symmetry of the plan. Ugaki shook his head. He announced that the Americans would never be that aggressive, and even if they were, the Japanese defences would shred them. He overruled the dice. He arbitrarily reduced the damage count. He declared that Kaga was sunk, but Akagi had only taken light damage. The game continued, but even the loss of 1 carrier was too bitter a pill to swallow. Later in the simulation, as the fleet moved to the next phase of the conquest, the Kaga, which had been ruled sunk just hours before, mysteriously reappeared on the table. The umpire had decided that sinking the carrier was inconvenient for the next stage of the exercise, so the Kaga was resurrected. The message to the officers in the room was clear. We are here to win, even if we have to cheat reality to do it. The officers left the Yamato confident. The game had proven the plan would work. But that confidence was built on a foundation of 3 deadly lies. The first lie was that their secrets were safe. The Japanese assumed they possessed the element of strategic surprise. They believed the Americans were blind, deaf, and dumb to their intentions. In reality, the Americans were reading their mail. In a basement in Hawaii, a team of codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25. They were intercepting fragments of radio traffic. They knew a massive operation was building. They knew the target code was AF. Washington thought AF was Hawaii or the West Coast. Rochefort believed it was Midway. To prove it, Rochefort set a trap of his own. He told the base at Midway to send an unencrypted message claiming their water distillation plant had broken. 2 days later, Japanese intelligence intercepted the message and reported to Tokyo that AF is short of water. Rochefort had them. He knew the target was Midway. He knew the date. He knew the forces involved. While Ugaki was moving wooden blocks on a map assuming total secrecy, the Americans were already moving their pieces to checkmate him. The second lie was about strength. The Japanese intelligence believed the American carrier fleet was crippled. They assessed that the carrier Yorktown had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May. They believed they would face only 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. 4 Japanese carriers against 2 American ones. The math was simple, the victory was assured, but the Yorktown was not dead. She had limped back to Pearl Harbor, trailing oil with her flight deck smashed and her internal frames buckled. Experts said she needed 3 months in a dry dock. Admiral Chester Nimitz gave them 3 days. It was a miracle of industrial will. 1,400 workers swarmed the ship. They welded plates, patched holes and bypassed safety regulations, working around the clock in a blackout. 72 hours later, the Yorktown sailed again, repair crews still on board, fixing the last systems as she headed for battle. Japan would not face 2 carriers. They would face 3. The third lie was about timing. The Japanese plan relied on the assumption that the American fleet would be caught napping in Pearl Harbor. They expected the U.S. Navy to rush out only after the attack on Midway began. Arriving too late, falling into the ambush Japan had prepared. But because Nimitz was reading their codes, he didn't wait. He sent his 3 carriers to a rendezvous point northeast of Midway called Point Luck. When the Japanese fleet arrived, the Americans weren't thousands of miles away. They were sitting right over the horizon, waiting in silence. On June 4, 1942, exactly 1 month after the rigged war game, the real dice were rolled. At 4:30 a.m., Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, launched his first wave of aircraft against Midway Island. 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers, and 36 Zeros roared into the dawn sky. Nagumo was a cautious man. He had kept half his planes on the decks, armed with torpedoes just in case American ships appeared. But his reconnaissance was a disaster. 1 scout plane from the cruiser Tone launched 30 minutes late because of engine trouble. That 30-minute delay would change the history of the world. The first wave struck Midway, but didn't knock it out. The flight leader radioed back, "A second attack is necessary." Now Nagumo faced a choice. He had planes on deck armed with torpedoes for ships, but there were no ships reported. He needed to hit the island again. He ordered the crews to switch weapons. The chaos began. Torpedoes were hauled off, bombs were hauled on. The hangars became a frantic mess of explosives and fuel hoses. Then at 7:28 a.m., the delayed scout plane finally reported a sighting. 10 enemy ships. Nagumo froze. Were there carriers? The scout didn't say. He halted the rearming process. Then a second message. Enemy carrier appears to be in rear. Panic. The nightmare scenario. Nagumo ordered the crews to switch back to torpedoes. Bombs were left rolling on the hangar decks. Fuel lines were everywhere. The carriers were now floating bombs, their insides packed with unsecured explosives, their decks crowded with planes trying to launch and land simultaneously. It was exactly the scenario the wargame had predicted. It was exactly the disaster the dice had warned about. But because Admiral Ugaki had overruled the dice, no one had a plan for this. The American attack began at 9:30 a.m. It did not go well. The first to arrive were the torpedo bombers from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown. They were flying the TBD Devastator, a plane so obsolete It was practically a death sentence to fly. It was slow, lumbering, and had to fly straight and level to drop its weapon. They had no fighter cover. They flew directly into the teeth of the Japanese defense. The Zeros swarmed them. It was a massacre. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was wiped out. 15 planes went in. All 15 were shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water, watching his friends die. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 10 of 14 were shot down, no hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked last. 12 of 13 destroyed. It seemed like a total failure. Dozens of American planes destroyed. 0 hits on the Japanese fleet. The Japanese pilots were cheering, their Zeros darting around the sky, shooting down the sluggish Americans with ease. But the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers was not in vain. In their desperate attacks, they had dragged the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level. The Zeros were all fighting just above the waves, focused on the low-flying torpedo planes. Their eyes were looking down, their guns were pointed down. The sky above the Japanese fleet was empty. High above, at 15,000 feet, hidden by the clouds, the American dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey from the Enterprise had been searching for the enemy for an hour. He was running on fumes. He had almost turned back, but then he saw a single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, cutting a white wake through the blue water, rushing to rejoin the fleet. McCluskey followed the wake. It led him straight to the target. At 10:22 a.m., the Japanese carriers Akagi and Kaga were visible below, their golden flight decks shining in the sun. They were vulnerable. Their decks were packed with planes refueling. Their hangars were cluttered with bombs and torpedoes. There were no fighters to stop the Americans. McCluskey tipped his wing and pushed into a near-vertical dive. Behind him, dozens of dauntless dive bombers screamed down from the heavens. The Japanese lookouts didn't see them until the bombs were already falling. The next 5 minutes were the most consequential moments in the history of naval warfare. The Kaga took 4 hits. The bombs smashed through the flight deck and detonated among the fully fueled planes and scattered explosives in the hangar. The ship turned into a blast furnace. The aviation fuel ignited, creating a river of fire that consumed the vessel. The Akagi, the flagship, took only 1 hit, but it was enough. The bomb penetrated the deck and exploded amidst the rearming aircraft. The chain reaction blew the elevators out of their shafts. The ship was gutted. Miles away, dive bombers from the Yorktown found the Soryu. 3 hits, 3 impacts that tore the ship apart. In 5 minutes, 300 seconds, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers were turned into burning wrecks. The pride of the Imperial Navy, the force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was erased. It was exactly what the dice had predicted in the game room on the Yamato. 2 carriers sunk by air attack. Chaos on the decks. But this time, Admiral Ugaki could not pick up the dice. He could not change the rules. He could only watch from the bridge of the Yamato as columns of black smoke rose into the sky, marking the graves of his empire's ambitions. The battle wasn't over. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that crippled the Yorktown. But later that afternoon, American bombers found the Hiryu and sent her to the bottom as well. By the next morning, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. 3,000 men were dead, including the elite pilots who could never be replaced. The Yorktown was lost, but the exchange was a catastrophe for Japan. They had lost the initiative. They had lost the war. They just didn't know it yet. In the aftermath, the Japanese government did what they did best. They lied. They announced a great victory to the public. The survivors were quarantined in hospitals, forbidden to speak to their families. The lost ships were kept on the active roster. The truth was buried. Admiral Ugaki survived the war, but only just. He served until the very last day. On August 15, 1945, after the Emperor announced the surrender, Ugaki stripped the badges of rank from his uniform. He climbed into a bomber and flew a final unauthorized kamikaze mission toward the American fleet off Okinawa. He died in a ball of fire, one of the last casualties of a war he helped prolong through arrogance. The wrecks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu now lie 3 miles deep at the bottom of the Pacific. They are silent monuments to a singular, devastating truth. Reality cannot be cheated. The war games of 1942 teach us a lesson that echoes far beyond military history. They show us the danger of surrounding ourselves with people who only tell us what we want to hear. When the dice rolled a 9, when the data showed a flaw, the leadership chose to ignore it because it was uncomfortable. They chose the illusion of safety over the hard work of preparation. The junior officer who played the Americans in that game room, the man whose name was never recorded, had predicted the battle better than all the admirals combined. He played to win. The admirals played to confirm their own brilliance. The most dangerous moment in any plan, whether it is a battle, a business, or a life, is the moment everyone agrees it cannot fail. Because that is the moment you stop looking for the icebergs. That is the moment you stop listening to the dice. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of World War II, make sure to hit that like button. It helps these stories reach more people. Subscribe for more untold history, and let me know in the comments. Do you think the war would have ended differently if Ugaki had listened to the dice? Thanks for watching.